The air on the Dakota prairie tasted like iron that November, cold enough to numb the tongue, dry enough to crack lips on the first breath. No trees between the cabin and the horizon, no sound but wind finding its way through tar paper and warped boards. The grass was brown and brittle, already dead, and the sky pressed down low and gray as if it meant to stay. A woman stood alone beside a woodshed, counting split sticks by eye the way a person counts coins they already know are short. Beside the shed, a drift had begun to build against the door. The claim near Lake Campesca measured 160 acres on paper. On the ground in November of 1880, it measured something closer to a punishment. Maren Tveit stepped down from the freight wagon that had carried her the last 9 miles from Watertown. The driver did not offer to help with her trunk. He looked at the tar paper shanty sitting alone on the frozen grass, looked at her, and said nothing. He left before she reached the door. The shanty was 16 by 18 feet. One cast iron box stove, one window, glass cracked in the lower corner and stuffed with a rag. The door latch was broken. A leather strap looped through a hole served instead. Outside, a woodshed stood 30 yards from the cabin, half its boards warped and pulling away from the frame. Inside the shed, less than 1.5 cords of split cottonwood leaned against the back wall. Some of the pieces were green. None were covered. Maren was 29 years old. She had been born in Wisconsin to Norwegian immigrants who rented farmland they would never own. Her father mended furniture and planed boards for other men's houses. Her mother rendered tallow, saved every wood shaving, and kept a kitchen where nothing was wasted because nothing could be replaced. Maren had learned carpentry scraps and stove tending the way most children learn weather, by living inside it every day. Her husband, Elias Tveit, had filed the claim with her name beside his. Then he had sold their ox team for $63, spent $40 on drink and cards in Watertown, and walked away carrying the rest. He left behind the claim, the hardware debt, and a wife who could not follow him because she had no team, no railroad fare, and no family left alive in Wisconsin. The hardware debt was $27 owed to the store in Watertown, where Elias had bought nails, hinges, stovepipe, and a pane of glass he never installed. The store's investor and collection agent was a man named Jonas Rusk, 38 years old, who had made a quiet business of buying distressed homestead claims at low cost after winter drove settlers off. If Maren abandoned the land, Rusk could take the improvements, the shanty, the shed, the broken fence posts for the price of the unpaid debt. She could not leave. There was no team to pull a wagon, no money for a train ticket east, no relatives waiting in any direction, and the claim itself, miserable as it stood, was the only thing in Dakota territory with her name attached to it. She had until January 15th to settle the $27, or Jonas Rusk would begin proceedings. The first snow had already fallen twice. The grass was brown and stiff. The wind came from the northwest without anything between it and the cabin for 200 miles. And the stove ate wood the way a sick animal drinks water, constantly, and never enough. 3 days after Maren arrived, a man named August Lindholm came to examine her stovepipe. She'd not invited him. Niels Brekke, the nearest farmer 1.25 miles east, had mentioned to Lindholm that the new woman on the Tveit claim had smoke backing into her cabin. Lindholm was 62, Swedish-born, a former Army wood contractor who had spent 11 winters supplying fuel to military posts across the northern plains. He knew stovepipe the way a surgeon knows bone. He did not make social calls. He came because a bad chimney in a tar paper shanty could kill someone before Christmas, and he preferred not to find the body. He arrived on a dun horse with a canvas tool roll tied behind the saddle. He did not knock. The leather strap served as both latch and announcement. He pulled it, and the door swung inward on one working hinge. Marin was standing at the stove, feeding a split stick into the firebox. Sawdust clung to her skirt from planing a warped shelf board. A smear of dried blood crossed her right knuckle where the hatchet had skipped while splitting kindling that morning. Lindholm looked at the stovepipe first. He tapped it with 2 fingers halfway up and listened. Then he crouched and examined the join where the pipe met the stove collar. He straightened, walked to the far wall, and pressed his palm flat against the boards. "You have gaps here wide enough to lose a finger through," he said. "Chinking is dried out. Wind comes through this wall like it is not there." He lifted a corner of the tar paper near the floor, saw daylight, and let it fall back. "How much wood do you have?" 1.5 cords, maybe less. Some is green." "Where?" "The shed. 30 yards. Lindholm walked outside. Marin followed. He stood at the woodshed and counted the split pieces by eye, the way a man counts money he already knows is short. He tested one piece with his thumbnail. Sap beaded on the cut face. "Green cottonwood," he said. "Burns fast, heats slow. You will go through this in 5 weeks if the weather holds mild. If the wind picks up and you're feeding the stove day and night, 3 weeks, maybe less." He turned and looked at the shanty. The stovepipe stuck up from the roof like a bent finger. One corner of the roof sagged where a support board had cracked. A Dakota winter in a plank shanty with gaps like yours, you need 6 cords minimum, 8 if you get a bad stretch. The stove draws hard because the cabin leaks. Every cord you burn, half the heat goes through the walls. "I know the cabin leaks," Marin said. "Then you know the math." Lindholm crossed his arms. 1.5 cords of green cottonwood against a winter that has already started. That is not a fuel supply. That is a suggestion. He was not cruel. His voice carried the flatness of a man who had counted fuel for outposts where soldiers froze to death 50 yards from a woodpile they could not reach in a blizzard. He had seen it. He did not enjoy saying it, but he said it. "The conventional solutions," he continued, "buy coal, haul more cordwood from the breaks, move into town and board with a family, or find someone with a team and trade labor for fuel." Marin said nothing for a moment. Then, "Coal requires cash I do not have. Cordwood requires a team I do not have. Town rent requires money I do not have. And no one with a team will trade labor with a woman alone on a claim everyone expects to fail." Lindholm looked at her. He had expected tears or anger, or the particular silence of someone who has already decided to quit. Instead, he got arithmetic. "You have a claim, shanty pretending to be a house," he said, "and a woman pretending she can winter in it." "I am not pretending anything," Marin said. "I am counting." Lindholm tapped the stovepipe again on his way out. "Get that collar reseated before the first hard freeze, and clean the pipe every 2 weeks. Creosote in a tar paper cabin is a funeral in a box." He rode away without looking back. Marin stood by the woodshed and counted the split pieces herself. She came up with the same number Lindholm had. It was not enough, not close. That night, she fed the stove 3 sticks and sat near it with a blanket over her shoulders. The wall behind her breathed cold air through every gap. The rag in the cracked window fluttered like something trying to get out. She had the tools her father had taught her to use: a hand plane, a draw knife, a hatchet. A mending instinct that turned broken things into working things. But tools could not conjure 6 cords of wood from frozen ground, and mending instinct could not seal a cabin that had been built by a man who intended to leave before winter. The doubt that kept her awake was not Lindholm's doubt. It was her own. She had come here because there was nowhere else. She had stayed because leaving meant losing the only ground she could claim. But staying meant betting her life on a winter she did not yet understand, in a house that could not hold heat, with fuel that would run out before February. She pulled the blanket tighter and listened to the stove tick as the fire burned low. Somewhere outside, a coyote called. Nothing answered. The accident happened on the 9th day. Marin had spent the morning planing a salvaged board to rebuild the shelf above the stove. The plane threw curls of dry pine that collected on the floor in pale spirals. She swept them into a flour sack and set the sack beside the stove, the way she had seen her father keep shavings, dry tinder, always within reach, never wasted. She had also been saving fat, bacon grease from the 3 slabs of pork belly she had brought from Watertown, tallow scraped from a piece of beef suite the butcher's boy had given her for 10 cents because it was too small to sell, drippings from the 1 hen she had slaughtered when it stopped laying. Each batch she strained through cloth into a jar, sealed the jar with a rag and string, and set it on the shelf. She did not have a plan for the fat. She saved it because throwing it away felt like throwing away money. In her mother's kitchen, fat was currency. It made candles, sealed cracks, greased hinges, waterproof boots, and kept iron from rusting. Fat meant options. On the 9th morning, she lifted a pan of warm bacon grease from the stove to carry it to the shelf. Her boot caught the flour sack. The pan tipped. Hot grease poured across the open mouth of the sack and soaked into the sawdust inside. Marin cursed. She set the pan down and reached into the sack, ready to scoop out the ruined sawdust and throw it into the snow. But she stopped. The sawdust had not become a greasy mess. It had absorbed the fat evenly, darkening from pale gold to a deep amber brown. The texture was firm, almost like damp sand, but not wet. It held together when she pressed it in her fist. It did not drip. She stood there holding a handful of fat-soaked sawdust and felt something shift in her memory. Her mother's kitchen, the tenant farmhouse in Wisconsin, Christy Tveit crouching beside a blackened kettle, rendering sheep fat over a peat fire, the fat turning clear as amber, wood shavings curling on the floor from her father's repair bench, her mother taking a pine splinter, dipping it into the melted tallow and lighting it, the flame catching slow and holding steady, longer than dry wood alone. Fat remembers fire, her mother had said. Wood starts it. Fat keeps it. Marin looked at the grease-soaked sawdust in her hand. Then she looked at the stove. She placed a pinch of the mixture on the iron shovel and held it over the coals. Loose, dry sawdust, she knew, flared hot and burned to nothing in seconds. Grease alone sputtered and smoked. But the soaked sawdust caught at the edges, darkened, and held a coal. The flame was small, but steady. It burned for nearly a minute before collapsing into gray ash that still glowed. 1 minute, from a pinch of garbage. The logic assembled itself through her hands, not her mind. Dry sawdust had enormous surface area, thousands of tiny fibers, each one ready to catch. Fat stored dense energy, the kind that burned slow and hot. Packing them together prevented the sawdust from flashing all at once. The fat slowed the burn. The wood fed it. She spent the rest of the day testing. 3 mixtures in broken teacups and a rusted muffin tin she had found behind the shed. The first, 2 handfuls of sawdust, 1 spoon of bacon grease. She packed it into a cup with her thumb. It crumbled when she turned it over. Too dry. Not enough fat to bind the fibers. The second, equal parts sawdust and grease, pressed hard. It held shape but burned smoky and wasteful. The excess fat melted out before the wood fibers caught fully. Grease pooled on the stove surface and spat. The third, 4 handfuls of dry sawdust, 1 heaping spoon of hardened tallow pressed tight into the cup with the back of a wooden spoon. She let it sit near the stove for an hour to firm, Then she placed it on the coals and opened the damper just a finger width. The cup held its shape. The edges darkened first. Smoke threaded upward, thin, not choking. The flame caught inside the mass, visible as a faint red glow through the packed surface. It burned, not fast, not flash, steady. The cup lasted nearly 4 minutes before it broke apart into a bed of coals that held heat for another 3. 7 minutes of heat from kitchen waste. Maren scratched marks into the shelf board with a nail. 4-1, dry first, press hard. No loose dust near flame. She made 3 more cups before supper. Each one burned within a minute of the last. Each one held its heat. The cabin smelled like pine and bacon, and something sharper underneath, the smell of tallow catching fire, a smell she remembered from her mother's kitchen, the way most people remember songs. She was not sure what she had found. She was not sure it mattered, but her hands kept working, and the cups kept stacking on the shelf like brown coins. The test came before she was ready for it. Niels Brekke arrived the next afternoon to return a borrowed auger. He was 41, a widower with 2 sons, a man whose barn was better built than his house because he understood livestock better than he understood comfort. He was practical, decent, and suspicious of anything that looked like desperation dressed as cleverness. He saw the cups lined up on the shelf. He saw the flour sack of sawdust. He saw the jars of strained grease. He looked at Maren the way a man looks at someone doing something he cannot identify. "What are those?" He pointed at the shelf. "Fuel," Maren said. Niels picked one up. It was dense, slightly tacky, and smelled like rendered fat and dry wood. He turned it over in his hands. "This is sawdust and grease." Sawdust and tallow, 4 parts to 1, packed tight. "And you are burning these in your stove." "I am testing them." Niels set the cup back on the shelf. His expression was not hostile. It was concerned, the way a neighbor gets concerned when someone they live near begins behaving strangely. "Sawdust in a stove is a chimney fire waiting to happen," he said. "Every farmer on the plains knows that. Loose dust hits hot iron, and you have flame in the pipe before you can close the damper." "It is not loose," Maren said. "It is packed. The fat binds it." "And grease belongs in cooking, not in heating. You are burning your food stores for warmth. By February, you will have no fat to cook with and no wood to burn." "I have more sawdust than I have wood, and I have more fat than I have coal." Niels looked at her. Then he said, "Show me." Maren placed a packed cup on a bed of coals in the firebox. She opened the damper 1 finger width, the way she had practiced. The cup darkened at the edges. Smoke rose. The flame caught inside and glowed. Then smoke pushed through a seam in the stovepipe collar, the same joint Lindholm had warned her about. The cabin filled with a thin haze that bit at the eyes. Niels coughed. Maren coughed. She closed the damper too fast, and the cup smothered and smoked harder before she cracked the damper again and let it settle. The cup burned, but the demonstration was ugly. Niels wiped his eyes. "That is not proof," he said. "That is warning." He left the auger on the table and walked out. At the door, he turned back and said, "I have 2 boys, Maren. If your stovepipe catches fire in the night, the wind carries sparks a long way." She heard him mount his horse and ride east. The cabin still smelled like smoke. The failure taught her 3 things. The sawdust had to be bone dry, not just surface dry, but cured. The fat had to be clarified, strained clean of meat scraps and impurities that burned acrid. And the stovepipe collar had to be reseated before she tested again, or every demonstration would end in smoke and coughing and a neighbor who rode away more convinced than before that she was building a disaster. She spent the next 2 days reseating the collar with clay and scraps of tin. She spread her sawdust on a board near the stove to dry, turning it twice a day. She reheated and strained her tallow through 3 layers of cloth until it poured clear as candle wax. The corrected cups burned clean, but nobody was there to see. Jonas Rusk saw to it that people heard about the cups anyway. Marin went to Havelock and Son General Store the following week to ask for cracked jars, dented tins, and sweepings from the carpentry corner, sawdust and shavings that the store discarded daily. The storekeeper was a tired man named Havelock, who would have given her the scraps without comment. But Jonas Rusk was standing at the counter. Rusk was 38. He wore a wool coat that fit him well, which in a settlement of patched homespun meant money. He was not the store's owner, but he had invested enough to treat the counter as his lectern. He bought distressed claims the way a patient man picks low fruit. He waited for winter, waited for failure, and offered to take the debt off hands that were already shaking. He had been watching Marin's claim since Elias left. $27 in hardware debt, a woman alone, and a shanty that would not survive February. He expected to own it by spring. When Marin asked Havelock for the scrap sawdust and cracked jars, Rusk spoke loud enough for the 4 other customers to hear. "The woman is storing stove dirt." He said it to no one in particular, the way a man speaks when he wants a room to laugh. 2 men near the nail bins looked up. A woman buying thread paused. Rusk continued. "Sawdust and kitchen fat. Jars of grease lined up like preserves. I have seen settlers go strange before winter, but this is early even by Dakota standards." Marin did not answer him. She picked up the sack of sweepings Havelock had pushed across the counter and reached for the cracked jars. Rusk stepped closer. "There's no shame in admitting a place is too much for a woman alone." His voice carried the performance of concern. "I can relieve you of the claim before winter proves what everyone already knows. $27 forgiven, and you are free to go wherever women go when they have finished pretending." The store was quiet. Havelock looked at the counter. The woman with the thread looked at the floor. Marin looked at Rusk. "Then you should have no trouble waiting until spring," she said. She carried the sack and the jars to the door. Behind her, Rusk said, "January 15th, Mrs. Tivit. $27 or I begin proceedings." The door closed behind her. The cold hit her face like a hand. The gossip moved through the settlement the way gossip does through practical channels. At the store. Outside the small frame church. Near the blacksmith's lean-to where men gathered to warm their hands and talk. The details shifted with each telling. Marin was saving ashes. Marin was hoarding grease. Marin had filled her cabin with sawdust and was burning garbage in her stove. A decent household cooked with fat, it was said. It did not hoard fat like medicine. The ridicule was not violent. It was the slow, casual kind that costs a person their place in a community. Fewer invitations came. The wives of 2 homesteaders who had previously offered to share bread stopped making the walk. A man who had once lent Marin a crowbar now avoided her at the store. The reputation forming around her was not merely eccentric. It was unstable. A woman hoarding waste in a failing cabin, alone, through the beginning of winter that was not someone people helped. That was someone people avoided so they would not be the one who found the body. Marin understood this. She had watched her mother endure the same quiet exclusion in Wisconsin when Christy Tveit had insisted on rendering her own tallow instead of buying candles from the store. "They laugh at saving," her mother had said, "because they have never run out." The social cost was real, but so was the debt clock, and so was the weather. She kept packing cups. December arrived like a door slamming. The temperature dropped 14 degrees in 2 days. The ground froze so hard that the nail Marin used to scratch marks on her shelf board would not penetrate the soil outside. The well rope stiffened until she had to crack it straight each morning before lowering the bucket. Ice formed on the inside of the window glass by the second week. Marin built a work rhythm that divided the day into 3 labors. Morning, she planed salvaged boards by the light from the window, sweeping sawdust into flour sacks as fast as the plane produced it. After the midday meal, she melted and strained fat, bacon grease from her shrinking supply of salt pork, tallow from a beef bone the butcher's boy sold her for 6 cents, drippings from anything that crossed her stove. Evening, she packed fuel cups by lamplight, pressing the 4-to-1 mixture into tins, cups, and muffin molds with the back of a wooden spoon, then lining them on the shelf above the stove to cure. Her hands paid for every cup, sawdust embedded under her nails, tallow burns spotted her knuckles, where hot grease spattered during straining. The wooden spoon handle raised a blister on her right palm that broke, healed, and broke again. She skipped meals twice in the first week to save the cooking fat for fuel. She learned through failure. Green sawdust from unseasoned scraps hissed and steamed instead of catching. Pine shavings alone flared too fast unless mixed with slower burning hardwood dust. Unstrained grease with bits of meat and gristle made acrid smoke that burned the throat and left black residue on the stove grate. She ruined 11 cups before the process became reliable. By December 6th, she had 32 cups cured and stacked. By December 12th, 87. But she tested one from the middle of the stack and found it soft. The tallow had not set fully because the shelf was too far from the stove. She moved the curing rack closer, lost 2 cups to melting, and started again. It was not enough. The math was simple and merciless. At 2 cups per hour of supplemental heat and 12 hours of cold per night, she needed roughly 700 cups to stretch from January through March if the wood ran out. She had 87, minus the soft ones. She tried to increase production. She planed boards faster, but fast planing produced coarse shavings instead of fine dust, and coarse shavings did not absorb fat evenly. She rendered a second batch of tallow, but the suet she had was nearly gone, and the butcher's boy in Watertown would not make the trip to her claim for 6 cents worth of scraps. She packed cups until her hands cramped and the blister on her palm split open for the 3rd time, leaving a raw spot that stung every time she pressed the spoon. The wind picked up on December 14th and did not stop for 3 days. Snow drove sideways against the north wall. Drifts built against the woodshed until the door was blocked by a bank of white that packed harder every hour. Marin spent a full morning digging a path to the shed, and by afternoon the wind had filled it back halfway. She dragged 8 split sticks inside and stacked them beside the stove, knowing each one represented a decision. Burn now to stay warm, or save for the night when the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. The stove consumed wood at a rate that made her calculations worse every morning. She burned 4 sticks where 3 had served a week ago. The gaps in the wall chinking that Lindholm had pointed out now whistled constantly, a thin, high sound that never stopped, not even when the wind paused to shift direction. Ice spread inward from the window corners. The rags stuffed into the cracked glass froze solid and no longer moved. On the 16th of December, Marin woke before dawn to find her water bucket frozen through. She cracked the ice with the hatchet handle and held a piece against her lips to drink. Her breath hung in the cabin like smoke. The stove had burned down to cold ash sometime in the night because she had set the damper wrong and the last stick had consumed itself too fast. She rebuilt the fire with 3 fuel cups and 2 sticks of dry cottonwood. The cups caught first, holding steady coals while the wood warmed and ignited. It worked, but the calculation tightened again. 3 cups burned meant 3 cups she could not count toward the winter total. 84 usable cups remained. The number sat in her chest like a stone. That was when Beret Asen arrived. Not by appointment, not by invitation. Beret traveled between settlements the way weather traveled. She appeared when conditions required her, and she left when the work was done. She was 56 years old, Norwegian-born, a midwife who carried herbs, needles, and a small hand sled packed with tinctures and clean cloth. She had delivered children in sod houses, set broken fingers in dugouts, and closed the eyes of 3 women who had died in labor on the open prairie. She'd also spent 20 years making soap and candles from rendered fat, a trade she had learned from her mother in Hallingdal, and carried across an ocean because it never stopped being useful. Beret knocked on the leather strap with one knuckle and entered without waiting. She was small, sharp-faced, and carried herself with the particular economy of motion that belongs to women who have walked long distances in bad weather their entire lives. She looked at the cabin. She looked at the stove. She looked at Marin's hands, the sawdust under the nails, the tallow burns, the blister. Then she looked at the shelf, rows of packed fuel cups, brown, dense, identical in size, lined up with the precision of someone who measured by instinct and corrected by failure. Barrette picked one up. She held it close to her face and smelled it. She pressed it with her thumb. She turned it over. "What ratio are you using?" she asked. Marin stared at her. In 6 weeks on the claim, no one, not Lindholm, not Brecka, not the store customers, not the gossiping neighbors, had asked her a serious question about the cups. 4 parts dry sawdust to 1 part clarified tallow, Marin said. Packed tight, cured near the stove for 2 days. Beret set the cup back on the shelf. "Your fat is not clean enough," she said. "I can smell meat in it. And your sawdust is not dry enough. The cups at the end of the row are lighter in color. That means moisture." "I know," Marin said. "I am learning." "Then learn faster," Beret said. "Winter does not wait for you to finish practicing." She set her sled outside the door, hung her coat on the nail by the stove, and sat down at the table. "Show me how you render," she said, and Marin did. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? What Beret taught in that first evening was not genius. It was discipline, the accumulated knowledge of a woman who had turned animal fat into clean, burning products for 2 decades. She took the rendering kettle from beside the stove and examined the residue inside. She scraped a fingernail across the bottom and held it to the lamp. Brown flecks clung to her nail, meat fiber, gristle, bits of tissue that Marin had not caught in the straining. "Every piece of this will smoke," Beret said. "Smoke is fuel you wasted, heat that went up the pipe instead of into the room." She showed Marin by doing it herself. She set the kettle on the stove with a knuckle of tallow inside and kept the heat low, barely enough to melt, never close to boiling. When impurities floated to the surface in a thin scum, she skimmed them with a flat spoon and wiped the spoon clean on a rag. She repeated this 3 times. The tallow that remained was nearly clear, pale as beeswax. "Test your sawdust like this," Beret said. She scooped a fistful from the flour sack, squeezed it in her closed hand, and opened her fingers. The sawdust held the shape of her fist for a moment, then crumbled apart. "Good. If it clumps cold and stays, there is moisture. Spread it thinner, turn it twice a day, wait another day before packing." She picked up one of Marin's cups and examined the solid mass inside. Then she pressed her thumb through the center, all the way to the bottom, and pulled it out. A clean channel remained, the width of a woman's thumb. "You have been filling them solid," Beret said. "The fire cannot breathe through a solid cake. It burns the surface and chokes on the inside. Leave this channel. When the cup sits on coals, air draws upward through the hole. The fire works inward from the center. It breathes through the cake instead of fighting around it. She dusted the outside of the repacked cup with dry wood ash from the stove grate, rubbing it in with her palm until the surface was matte gray instead of sticky brown. Ash slows the surface, keeps it from catching too fast on the outside while the center heats. You want the fire to start inside and spread out, not the other way. Marin listened. Then she did it. Her first cup with the thumb hole burned differently than anything she had made before. The flame drew inward and downward through the channel, catching the dense sawdust fat mixture from the center out. Smoke was thin. Heat was steady. The cup lasted nearly 8 minutes, twice the burn time of her old solid cakes. "You are not saving trash," Beret said, watching the stove. "You are saving choices." Outside, the wind found every gap in the north wall and made the tar paper snap. December was halfway gone. The outdoor woodpile was buried under a drift that would take an hour to dig through. The temperature had not risen above 10 degrees in 4 days. Marin had 146 usable cups and a mentor who had just doubled their effectiveness. But she needed 700, and winter was not waiting. Beret stayed 3 days. She did not explain why. She did not ask permission. She slept on a folded blanket beside the stove and rose before Marin each morning to check the curing cups, turning them one by one and pressing each with her thumb to test firmness. The ones that gave too easily she set aside. The ones that held she returned to the shelf without comment. On the second day, she showed Marin how to build a drying rack from scrap boards. 2 planks suspended on pegs above the stove, spaced wide enough for air to pass between the cups, but close enough to catch rising heat. The sawdust dried twice as fast on the rack. Cups that had taken 2 days to cure now firmed in 1. "Your mother made candles," Beret said. It was not a question. "Tallow candles, dipped wicks." Then she knew what I know. Fat rendered clean burns clean. Fat rendered dirty burns angry. Beret held a cup to her nose. "This one is good. You are learning." On the 3rd morning, Beret packed her sled, pulled on her coat, and stood at the door. She looked at the shelf, now holding 171 cups in neat rows. "You need more fat," she said. "The sawdust will come. Boards are everywhere, but clean fat is the thing that limits you. Find it where men throw it away. The butcher shop floor, the cooking pits after a hog killing, the grease traps behind any kitchen that feeds working men. They will think you are scavenging. Let them think it." She left without saying goodbye. Marin watched her sled cut a narrow track through the snow until the track bent south and disappeared behind a low rise. The cabin felt larger without her, and colder. Marin followed Beret's advice about fat the way a thirsty person follows a creek, without pride and without stopping. She walked 2 miles to the Hendrickson place, where a hog had been slaughtered the week before, and asked for the scraps. Mrs. Hendrickson gave her a bucket of trimmings and fat-soaked rags, and looked at her the way people look at someone they have already started mourning. Marin carried the bucket home on her hip, rendered it that evening, and got enough clean tallow to pack 14 cups. She traded a repaired chair rung to the blacksmith for a pail of grease skimmings from his forge cooling trough. The grease was filthy, black with iron scale and soot. She rendered it 3 times before it ran clear enough to use. 8 more cups. She found a broken crate behind Havelock and Son and carried it home on her back in a wind that cut through her coat and numbed her hands before she reached the claim. The crate yielded 2 flour sacks of dry pine sawdust when she broke it apart and planed the boards. 22 cups. Every source of waste became an opportunity. Every trip into the settlement cost time and warmth and dignity, and every night she packed cups at the table by lamplight until her eyes blurred and the blister on her palm wept clear fluid onto the spoon handle. December 19th, 146 usable cups, plus the 25 berets drying rack had saved. 171 total. Not enough. Not close. But the number was moving. On December 21st, August Lindholm returned. He did not come to help. He came because curiosity had bothered him for 3 weeks, and because a man who has spent his life calculating fuel loads cannot stop calculating, even for someone else's stove. He tied his horse to the shed post and knocked on the leather strap. Maren opened the door. Steam curled from a kettle on the stove. She was rendering a batch of mutton tallow from a sheep that had died at the Morrison claim. Lindholm looked at the shelf. The cups had multiplied since his last visit. They stretched across the drying rack and along both walls, stacked 2 deep in some places. Brown, uniform, ash-dusted. The cabin smelled like pine resin and clean fat. He picked one up, turned it over, and found the thumb hole. He raised an eyebrow. "Who showed you this?" he asked. Beret Asen." "The midwife." "The soap maker." Lindholm held the cup near the stove's heat and watched for softening. The surface held firm. He pressed his thumb against the ash coating. It did not stick. "These are better than what you showed Brecca," he said. "That was a parlor trick. This is something else." "They burn 8 minutes each," Maren said. "The old ones burned 4. Lindholm set the cup down. He looked at the stove, then at the walls, then at the pile of split wood beside the door, noticeably smaller than a month ago. "How many do you have?" 171. I need at least 500 more." "You need those 500 before the first week of January. After that, storms come in clusters. 3 days, 4 days, a week. If your shed is buried and your indoor wood runs low, these cups are all that stands between you and a cold stove." "I know." "You cannot make 500 cups in 2 weeks." "I know that too." Lindholm crossed his arms, the same posture as his first visit, but his voice had shifted, not warmer, but less certain. "I still say these cannot replace cordwood. A cup that burns 8 minutes is not a log that burns 2 hours. You're stretching, not solving." "I'm not trying to replace wood," Maren said. "I'm trying to survive the hours when wood is not enough or not reachable." Lindholm studied her face. Then he looked at the stovepipe. He tapped it. The sound was solid. Maren had reseated the collar and cleaned the pipe twice since his first visit. "Your pipe is clean," he said. "That is the first thing you have done that I cannot argue with." He left without offering help, but he also left without repeating the word impossible. Maren noticed the difference. Christmas Eve came without celebration. Maren marked it by counting 212 cups cured, 63 more drying on the rack, and less than 3/4 of a cord of reachable wood. The outdoor pile was buried under a drift that had frozen into a crust hard enough to walk on. Digging through it required the hatchet, not a shovel. Each retrieval trip cost an hour and left her gasping in cold that stole breath from the lungs before it reached the blood. The trains had stopped. Word came from the Hendrickson place that no freight had moved through Watertown for 9 days. Coal was unavailable. Kerosene was rationed at the store. Jonas Rusk had raised the price of lamp oil by 1/3 because he could. Maren allowed herself one luxury on Christmas Eve. She burned 3 cups and 2 split logs at the same time, pushing the stove temperature high enough that the frost on the far wall retreated for 2 hours. She sat near the warmth and ate salt pork and a boiled potato and thought about her mother pressing tallow into tin molds while snow piled against the Wisconsin farmhouse windows. The next morning, she was back at the table packing cups. December 27th, 241 cups. The drying rack held another 30, but 12 on the bottom shelf had gone soft. Mice had chewed through the flour sack underneath and dragged sawdust into the wall space. She lost the 12 and spent half a day sealing the gap with tin scraps and clay. The setbacks kept coming. A jar of clarified tallow cracked near the stove when the temperature swung too fast, spilling clean fat across the floor. She scraped it up with a knife, but grit and ash contaminated it. She re-rendered what she could and lost the rest. Another day gone. Another handful of cups that should have existed and did not. Her body was paying. The blister on her palm had become a callus, but the callus split during cold mornings. Her shoulders ached from planing. She had lost weight, the salt pork was nearly gone, and she was choosing between eating fat and burning fat. She chose burning. The stove did not negotiate. Minai. On the 29th of December, a boy appeared at her door. Peter Brecke was 12 years old, the younger of Niels's two sons. He was thin, quiet, and had the particular watchfulness of a child who has learned that adults do not always explain what matters. He carried a flour sack over one shoulder, and the sack was heavy. "From the carpenter's shop," he said. "Planer shavings. Mr. Olson sweeps them out every morning. I asked if I could take them." Maren opened the sack. Dry, pale curls of pine and oak, fine-grained, clean, better sawdust than anything she had produced from her salvaged boards. "Does your father know you are here?" she asked. Peter looked at the ground. "No. Why did you bring this?" The boy shifted the empty sack to his other hand. "You fixed my sled runner. Father said the runner could not be fixed. You fixed it in an hour." Maren looked at him. She looked at the sack. The shavings inside would make 30 cups at least. Maybe 40. "Thank you, Peter," she said. He came back twice more before Niels found out. Each time the sack was full. Each time Peter left quickly, as if speed could make the trip invisible. Niels discovered it on the second day of January. He arrived at Maren's door with his jaw set and Peter walking 3 steps behind him. "My son has been stealing sawdust for you," Niels said. "He has been bringing me what a carpenter throws away." "He has been sneaking. That is stealing from his father's trust, whatever the material." Maren said nothing. She could see Peter behind his father, eyes fixed on the snow at his boots. "She fixed what you said could not be fixed," Peter said. His voice was small but steady. Niels turned to his son. The anger in his face did not break, but something behind it shifted, the particular discomfort of a man whose child has said something true at the wrong moment. "Go home," Niels said to Peter. Then to Maren, "I do not want my boy making this walk in weather that can kill him." "Then bring the shavings yourself," Maren said. "Or do not. But do not punish him for thinking clearly." Niels left. He did not bring shavings. But the next morning, a flour sack appeared on Maren's doorstep, packed tight with dry oak shavings. No note. No name. Maren carried it inside and began packing cups. By the 4th of January, she had 312. The control test came on the 5th of January. Maren set the stove with 2 split logs and 3 fuel cups arranged around them. She closed the damper to a narrow gap and let the fire settle. Beret's crude oven thermometer, a salvaged dial from a broken range, hung from a wire inside the firebox where Maren could read it through the draft opening. At 10 o'clock in the evening, the thermometer read 51 degrees inside the cabin. The wind was steady but not violent. The walls breathed cold through the gaps, but the stove held. She fed 1 cup every 40 minutes. Each cup caught from the coals, glowed through its thumbhole, and burned steady for close to 10 minutes before collapsing into a hot ash bed. The ash bed held warmth between cups. The logs burned slow, supplemented rather than replaced. At 4 in the morning, the cabin had not dropped below 44 degrees. The stove body was warm to the touch. The 2 logs were half consumed. She had used 7 cups total. 7 cups, 6 hours. The cabin had not frozen. She scratched 6 marks on the stove shelf and sat on the edge of her bed. The thermometer held steady. It worked, not luxuriously, not magically. The far walls still crusted with frost. The water bucket still grew a skin of ice by morning, but the cabin had held a temperature that kept a body alive through the coldest hours. The question had never been whether she could be comfortable. The question was whether she could survive, and 7 cups had bought her 6 hours of the answer. Beret returned the next morning, earlier than expected. She had delivered a healthy child at the Olson claim and walked back through light snow. She examined the stove, counted the ash, and read the thermometer without speaking. "A test night is not a storm night," she said. "A house behaves different when the wind wants in. The stove draws harder, the walls lose faster. You will burn twice what you burned last night." "I know," Marin said. "That is why I need every cup I can make between now and whenever the weather decides to come." Beret looked at the shelf, now burdened with rows of brown cups stacked like bricks. 312, plus the one still curing. She nodded once. "You have more than most," she said. "That does not mean you have enough." The weather turned deceptive in the second week of January. A thaw softened the top layer of snow. Water ran in thin streams along the frozen ruts of the road. The sun appeared for 3 consecutive days, low and yellow, casting long shadows that made the prairie look almost gentle. Men in the settlement began to say that the worst had passed. January thaws happened. Maybe the winter would ease. Marin did not believe it. She had watched her mother read weather through animals, not almanacs. The chickens in the lean-to behind the cabin refused to leave the enclosure, even when Marin opened the gate. They pressed together in the far corner with their heads tucked. The cat that sometimes sheltered under the shed had disappeared 3 days ago, and the sky, for all its brightness, had a quality of light that felt held, as if the air itself was waiting. Then the freeze came back. Hard. The softened snow sealed into a crust that crackled underfoot like broken pottery. Ice formed in the well bucket overnight. The stars that night were sharp and close, as if the sky had lowered toward the ground. On the 12th of January, Beret packed her sled. "The Henriksen woman is expecting," she said. 2 miles east. She's early, and her husband is in Watertown trying to buy flour. I will be back by morning." Marin watched her leave. The sled runners hissed across the frozen crust. Beret's figure grew smaller against the white until it was just a dark mark on the horizon, and then nothing. The cabin felt the way it had felt after Beret's first departure. Too large, too quiet, and too cold for one person. Marin counted her supplies. 312 cured cups, 1 full indoor kindling box, less than 1 quart of wood she could reach without major digging. The outdoor woodshed stood 30 yards away, an ordinary distance in fair weather. She stacked 6 cups beside the stove for the night and closed the damper. She checked the stovepipe. She filled the water bucket. She bolted the door with the leather strap and a wooden bar she had carved to brace it. Then she waited. Kigal. The blizzard arrived without the warning that modern minds expect. The first sign was not wind. It was silence. A sudden, total absence of sound. No coyotes, no cracking ice, no tree creak from the cottonwood stand a quarter-mile south. The prairie held its breath. Then the north wall shuddered. The wind did not build. It arrived at full force, slamming into the tar paper shanty like something thrown. Snow came sideways, hard as flung sand, hitting the window glass with a hiss that sounded like water poured onto a hot stove. The stove pipe moaned. The leather strap on the door strained against the wooden bar. Within 2 hours, the door would not open more than 3 inches. Snow packed into the gap with a density that resisted the heel of Marin's boot. She put her shoulder against the door and pushed. It moved half an inch and stopped. Something enormous was leaning against the other side. By nightfall, the window was packed white, not frost. Snow pressed against the glass from outside, solid and opaque. The cabin became a box with one source of light, the lamp, and one source of heat, the stove. By the second morning, the woodshed had disappeared. Marin knew where it stood, 30 yards north and slightly west. She could have walked there in 40 seconds on a clear day, but the wind was carrying snow at speeds that turned visibility to 0 at arm's length, and the temperature had dropped to a place where exposed skin froze in minutes. 30 yards might as well have been 30 miles. The indoor kindling box held enough split wood for perhaps a day and a half of normal burning. After that, the only fuel within reach was the shelf of brown cups lining the cabin walls. 312 of them, packed tight, ash-dusted, thumb holes open, waiting. Complications arrived in layers, each one tightening the vise. The stove pipe began drawing poorly on the second day. Blowing snow packed around the exterior cap where it extended above the roof. Smoke backed into the cabin in thin wisps that made Marin's eyes water. She climbed onto a chair and reached the pipe joint near the ceiling, tapping it with the hatchet handle to loosen the obstruction. A clump of frozen snow dropped into the firebox with a hiss. The draw improved, but she knew the problem would return. Her right palm, the one with the old blister callus, split open when she tried to pry the door latch on the second evening. She had been checking the drift level, trying to gauge whether the snow had stabilized. The iron latch was frozen, and when it gave way, the edge caught her palm and opened a cut across the base of her thumb. Blood ran down her wrist and froze on her coat sleeve before she could wrap it. She bound the hand with a strip of clean cloth and packed a cup one-handed. The cup sat crooked in the tin. She straightened it with her teeth. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because the next choice decides whether this cabin becomes shelter or a coffin. On the third night, she heard pounding, not wind pounding, a fist, irregular, desperate, and low, hitting the wall near the base of the door where the drift had not yet sealed the last 6 inches of gap. Marin dropped to her knees and pressed her face near the floor. Cold air screamed through the crack. Through the gap, she could see a shape, dark against white, small, shaking. She grabbed the hatchet and chopped at the frozen snow packed against the bottom of the door. Chunks of ice broke loose and scattered across the cabin floor. She chopped until the gap widened to 10 inches, then 12, then enough to reach through and grab what was on the other side. It was Peter Breke. He was 12 years old, and he was half frozen. His coat was packed with snow. His lips were blue-gray. His hands, gloveless, were white at the fingertips and waxy. He had crawled on his belly through the drift for the last 30 yards. Marin pulled him through the gap like pulling a child through a window. He weighed almost nothing against the resistance of the snow. She dragged him to the stove and stripped his coat and boots while he shook with a violence that was beyond shivering, his whole body convulsing in waves. "Beret," he said. His voice was a croak. "Beret's sled. Overturned. Near our place. Father sent me. Father's hand." The words came in fragments. Marin assembled them while she wrapped the boy in every blanket she had. Beret's sled had overturned near the Breke farm. Niels had tried to reach her and had frostbitten 2 fingers on his right hand. Beret was sheltered at the Breca house, but was hurt. A bruised shoulder, maybe cracked ribs. Niels had sent Peter to Marin because the Breca stove was failing. They were running low on indoor fuel. The shed was buried. Niels could not dig with a damaged hand. Marin looked at the boy shivering on her floor. She looked at the shelf of fuel cups. She looked at the stove. The kindling box was nearly empty. 4 split sticks remained. She had been burning cups exclusively since the second day, rationing them at one every 40 minutes the way Beret had taught, damp or narrow, draft through the thumb hole, patience. Now she had to make a choice that the controlled test on January 5th had not prepared her for. She could conserve. Burn 1 cup per hour, stretch the supply, keep herself and Peter alive inside this cabin, and hope the storm broke before the cups ran out. Or she could burn faster, warm the boy properly, and accept that every cup burned now was a cup that would not exist tomorrow. She chose the boy. She placed 2 cups on the coals and opened the damper a quarter turn wider than she had been running. The cups caught. The thumbholes drew flame inward. The stove body began to warm under her good hand. She placed a 3rd cup 20 minutes later, an extravagance that made her stomach tighten. Beret's salvage thermometer climbed. 41 degrees, 46, 52, 58. Peter's shivering slowed. Color crept back into his face. His fingers, the worst of them, shifted from waxy white to an angry red that meant the blood was returning. He would lose no fingers, but the pain of thawing made him cry in a way that was worse than the silence of the frozen child who had crawled through her door. Marin fed the stove with the discipline Beret had drilled into her. 1 cup every 40 minutes in normal mode. 2 cups in the first hour to build the heat base. Never loose sawdust, always packed, always cured, always through the thumb hole. She cleaned the grate twice with a bent spoon, scraping ash into the ash pan so airflow stayed clear. When 1 undercured cake smoked, she had grabbed it from the drying rack in haste. She cracked the damper wider for 30 seconds, let the smoke draw up, and narrowed it again. The cabin was not paradise. The far walls still crusted with frost. Marin's breath still showed white when she turned away from the stove. The water bucket grew a skin of ice that she broke every hour. But near the stove, where Peter lay wrapped in blankets, the thermometer read 61 degrees on the 4th night and 72 on the 5th, the warmest it had been since the storm began. The stove held. The cups held. The thumb holes drew air the way Beret had promised. Inward, steady, controlled. Each cup burned its 8 to 10 minutes and collapsed into a coal bed that bridged the gap to the next. The logs she fed every few hours, 1 small split stick at a time, caught faster because the coal bed was already hot. Marin tracked consumption on the shelf board with scratch marks. 10 cups the first night with Peter, 14 the second day, 12 the third. The count climbed and the supply shrank, and every mark was a small calculation of faith against arithmetic. Outside, the settlement was drowning. Niels Breca, unable to dig his buried woodshed with 2 frostbitten fingers, had tried to reach the pile by chopping through the drift with a hatchet held in his left hand. He lasted 20 minutes before the wind drove him back inside. His family burned their last indoor wood on the 4th day and began breaking apart a shelf and a bench for fuel. August Lindholm, sheltering a stranded family in his barn, rationed his coal supply across 3 stoves and ran low by the 6th day. He burned hay on the 7th, a measure so desperate it risked the barn itself. Jonas Rusk was trapped at Havelock and Son General Store with flour, ledgers, and no dry kindling. His firewood was stacked outside under a drift 6 feet deep. He had lamp oil, but no way to heat the building. He sat behind his counter in his good wool coat and watched the temperature fall inside his own store. And 3 miles south, In a dugout near the creek bottom, a bachelor settler named Hob did not survive the 5th day. His stove went cold sometime in the night. His split wood stood in a neat stack outside the door, visible, reachable on any ordinary day, and buried under 8 feet of compacted snow. When they found him after the storm broke, one boot was by the door and one hand rested near a spent match tin. He had tried to light something. There was nothing left to light. Maren did not know about Hob. She did not know about Lindholm's hay fires or Rusk's cold store. She knew only the inside of her cabin, the boy sleeping near her stove, and the row of cups that shrank by the day. On the 7th morning, she looked out through the gap she kept chipped at the base of the door and saw something, a red cloth tied to a pole, whipping in the wind 100 yards east. Niels Brecke had tied it between gusts as a signal. Maren could not read it. It could mean help needed or help offered, or simply the declaration of someone still alive. But she understood what the distance meant. 100 yards of waist-deep snow in a wind that could kill in 10 minutes. She could not reach him, but maybe she could reach part of the way. That afternoon, when the wind dropped from a roar to a moan, not calm, but survivable for minutes at a time, Maren made a decision that expanded her invention from private survival to something else entirely. She packed 6 fuel cups into a lard tin. She sealed the tin with a rag and tied it with rope. She wrapped herself in every piece of clothing she owned, including Pater's dried coat over her own. She pushed through the gap at the base of the door, belly down in the drift, and crawled. The snow was not soft. It was packed by wind into a surface that held her weight in some places and collapsed in others. She dragged the tin behind her on the rope. The wind hit her face with a cold so sharp it felt like burning. She kept her eyes shut and navigated by the angle of the wind itself. It came from the northwest, and Niels was due east. She made it 40 yards, maybe 50. She could not be sure. The red cloth was closer, but still unreachable. She dug a hollow in the drift, wedged the lard tin into it, and piled snow over it in a mound she hoped would be visible when the wind shifted. Then she crawled back. It took Pater, rested and warmer now, to make the connection. The next day, when the wind dropped again, the boy crawled east from Maren's door and found the tin. He kept crawling. He made it to within shouting distance of the Brecke cabin, and Niels, one hand bandaged, the other gripping a rope tied to the doorframe, hauled him the last 15 yards. The 6 cups burned that night in the Brecke stove. It was not enough to heat the cabin. It was enough to keep the coals alive while Niels broke apart a trunk for wood. The family survived the 8th night because the cups bridged the gap between the last piece of furniture and the first moment Niels could chip fuel from the woodshed on the 9th day when the wind finally thinned. Inside Maren's cabin, the count stood at 93 cups remaining. She had burned 219. The storm had lasted 9 days. The stove had not gone cold for a single hour. On the morning of the 10th day, the wind stopped. The silence was so sudden and so total that Maren thought she had gone deaf. She stood by the stove with a cup in her good hand and listened to nothing. Then she heard a sound she had not heard in 10 days. A bird. She dug upward, not outward. The door was buried. She climbed onto the chair, reached the stovepipe joint near the ceiling, and loosened the section Lindholm had helped her seat. Cold air poured in. Through the gap, she could see blue. Pure, hard, empty blue, the color of a sky that has spent everything it had. She widened the gap and pushed through onto the snow surface. The prairie was unrecognizable. The woodshed roof was level with the snow, the entire structure buried to its peak. The settlement was a white field interrupted by stovepipes and chimney tops like stubble. Smoke rose from some. From others, nothing. Marin stood on the snow above her buried cabin and looked east toward the break place. A thin line of smoke rose there. They were alive. She looked south. No smoke from Hobbs' dugout. None. She looked back at the hole she had climbed through. Below her, inside the cabin, the stove ticked quietly. Peter was awake, sitting up in his blankets, looking at her through the opening. "Is it over?" he asked. Marin did not answer immediately. She looked at the white plain and the few threads of smoke in the places where no smoke rose. She felt the cold air on her cut hand and the weight of 9 days in her shoulders and the particular emptiness that comes after fear has lived inside your chest for so long it feels like an organ. "The storm is over," she said. What came next was something else entirely. The settlement dug itself out in stages. Men emerged from buried doorways and stood blinking on the snow surface like animals leaving dens. Smoke rose from the cabins that had survived. From the ones that had not, silence. Marin carried Peter home on the second morning after the storm. The walk was 100 yards across, snow packed hard enough to hold their weight. Peter walked on his own, bundled in every cloth Marin could spare, his frostbitten fingers wrapped and healing. The Brecca cabin had smoke rising from its chimney, thin but rising. Niels met them at the door. His right hand was bandaged in strips of flour sack, 2 fingers splinted with flat sticks. He looked at his son. He looked at Marin. He did not speak immediately. Then he said, "Come inside." The Brecca cabin was cold, not frozen. The stove held coals, but cold in the way a house gets when fuel has been rationed to the edge of nothing. The walls were bare where shelves had been. A bench was missing. The trunk that Marin had seen by the door on her last visit was gone, broken into fuel. Niels sat down at the table and placed his bandaged hand flat on the surface. His 2 sons sat against the far wall, watching. "I burned the trunk on the 8th night," Niels said. "The bench on the 7th, the shelf boards on the 6th. Your cups kept the coals alive long enough for the furniture to catch." He paused. "Without the cups, the stove would have gone cold on the 5th day." Marin said nothing. She waited. "I thought you were feeding fear instead of stock," Niels said. He used the same words he had spoken weeks ago when the cups were a curiosity and the blizzard was a theory. But the words sounded different now, smaller, like coins that had been spent. "I was feeding the stove," Marin said. Niels looked at his bandaged hand. "I have 2 fingers that may not straighten again because I tried to reach a woodshed 30 yards from my door. 30 yards, and I could not cover it." He looked up. "How many cups do you have left?" 93. "Can you make more?" "I can make as many as there is dry sawdust and clean fat to pack." Niels nodded slowly. "Show me how." August Lindholm arrived 3 days later. He came on foot because his horse had gone lame during the storm, and he walked 2 miles through snow that reached his thighs in the drifts. He was 62 years old, and he did not stop once. He entered Marin's cabin without knocking, the way he had the first time. He stood by the stove and looked at the shelf. The rows were thinner now, 93 cups where 312 had stood. But the stove was warm. The cabin smelled like pine and tallow and clean ash. The thermometer Beret had given Marin hung from its wire, reading 54 degrees. Lindholm examined the ash pan first. He scooped a handful and rubbed it between his fingers. Dense, powdery, lighter in color than wood ash. He smelled it. Then he examined a cured cup from the shelf, pressing the thumb hole, testing the surface, weighing it in his palm. "How many did you burn during the storm?" he asked. 219, over 10 days. "How many hours did the stove hold?" "Every hour. I fed it every 40 minutes at the beginning. Every hour once the body was warm. Lindholm set the cup back on the shelf. He was quiet for a long time. Then he walked to the stovepipe and tapped it. The sound was solid and clear. The Morrison family burned their indoor wood in 3 days, he said. They broke apart their bed frame on the 4th. The Hendricksons made it to the 6th by burning hay, but hay burns too fast and nearly caught the wall. I sheltered the Petersons in my barn and ran out of coal on the 7th day. I burned hay myself after that. He paused. I lost a good harness to the fire because there was nothing else to burn, and a child was shivering. He turned to Marin. I was wrong about one thing, he said. Waste can be fuel, but only if a person knows how to make it behave. You were not wrong about everything, Marin said. The cups cannot replace cordwood. They bridge the gap when wood is not enough or not reachable. That gap, Lindholm said, is the gap that kills people. He sat down at her table, the first time he had ever sat in her cabin, and asked her to explain the method from the beginning. Not the idea, the measurements, the ratios, the failures, what went wrong and what she changed. Marin told him, and for the first time, the telling felt like something other than defense. It felt like teaching. Within 2 weeks, 6 families had come to Marin's cabin to ask about the cups. They did not come out of admiration. They came out of fear. The storm had shown every household in the settlement what 30 yards of impassable snow could do to a fuel supply. The families that had nearly frozen did not want theory. They wanted instructions. Marin taught them the way Beret had taught her, through action, not lecture. She set up the rendering kettle on the stove and demonstrated clean fat. She squeezed sawdust in her fist and showed them the clump test. She packed a cup with the 4-to-1 ratio, pressed the thumb hole, dusted it with ash, and set it on the coals. They watched it burn. She insisted on rules. Dry sawdust only, never green, never damp, never sawdust that had been stored on a dirt floor. Clean rendered fat strained until it poured clear. Small packed forms, never loose sawdust poured into flame, which flashed and could ignite a chimney. Open draft at lighting, reduced after the catch. Chimney inspected every 2 weeks. Never store cured cups close enough to the stove to melt. The rules mattered because the method was not safe if done carelessly. It was safe because Marin and Beret had made it safe, through testing, through failure, through 11 ruined cups in a smoky cabin, and a demonstration that made Niels Breke cough. The margin between working fuel and a chimney fire was discipline, not luck. A woman named Sigrid Haugen, whose husband had frostbitten his feet trying to reach their coal shed, asked the question Marin had expected. Why did you not tell us before the storm? I did not know it would work before the storm, Marin said. I knew it burned. I did not know it could keep a cabin alive for 10 days. That answer carried the weight of honesty, and the room accepted it. But not everyone in the settlement was in the room. Jonas Rusk heard about the teaching sessions the way he heard about everything, through the store, where information moved like currency. He heard that Marin Tveit was instructing families on fuel. He heard that people were saving sawdust. He heard that August Lindholm, a man whose opinion carried weight, had called her method sound. Rusk said nothing publicly, but Marin noticed that the January 15th debt deadline came and went without a visit from his agent. The $27 remained unpaid. Rusk was waiting. For what? She did not yet know. Beret returned to Marin's cabin in late January, carried on a neighbor's sled because she could not walk the distance. The overturned sled had bruised her shoulder and cracked 2 ribs on her left side. She breathed in shallow catches and winced when she turned. But her eyes were clear and her hands were steady, and the first thing she did when she entered the cabin was pick up a cured cup and check the thumb hole. You survived, Beret said. We survived, Pater and I. And the cups? 219 burned, 93 left. I'm already making more. Beret sat down on the bed, the only seat soft enough for her ribs, and watched Marin pack cups at the table. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The stove ticked. The wind pressed against the north wall, steady but not violent. The kind of wind that reminds you winter is still present, but no longer trying to kill you today. I was at the breckie place for 6 days, Beret said. Niels broke apart a bench and a trunk to feed the stove. His wife cried when he pulled the nails from the bench because her mother had built it. She paused. Your cups arrived on the 8th day. 6 cups. It was enough to keep Coles alive until he could chop the trunk. I know, Marin said. Peter told me. 6 cups, Marin. 6. And a family lived because of them. Beret shifted on the bed, grimacing. I only showed you how to clean what you already knew. They worked together for the next 3 weeks. Beret could not stand for long, so she sat at the table and rendered fat while Marin planed boards and packed cups. They developed a rhythm. Beret strained, Marin packed. Beret tested dryness. Marin adjusted ratios. They spoke in short exchanges, the kind of conversation that happens between people working on the same thing in the same room, where a single word carries a whole instruction. Together they refined the cups into 3 types. Quick cups used more shavings and less fat, a lighter mix that caught fast on cold iron and produced enough heat to wake a dead stove. Marin made these in muffin tins, small and rough, and stored them in a pouch near the firebox. They were starters, not sustainers. Night cakes were the opposite: dense sawdust, clarified tallow, ash dusted on every surface, packed so tight the thumbhole held its shape for days without sagging. They burned 10 to 12 minutes and left a coal bed hot enough to bridge 2 hours if the damper was set right. These were the cups that had kept Marin alive during the blizzard. Travel tins were Beret's idea. Small wrapped blocks packed into sealed tins that could ride in a sled, a coat pocket, or a saddlebag. Marin had used an improvised version during the blizzard, the lard tin she crawled across the snow with, but Beret formalized them. She lined tins with waxed cloth to keep moisture out and packed the fuel tight enough that the blocks would not crumble in transit. Each tin held 3 blocks. 3 blocks could warm a cold room long enough to dry wood or deliver a child or keep a man's hands from freezing while he dug for his woodpile. The travel tins changed how Marin thought about the cups. They were no longer a stationary reserve stacked on a shelf. They were portable warmth, heat that moved with the person instead of waiting at the stove. During those weeks, Beret's backstory emerged not through confession, but through work. She mentioned Hallingdal the way someone mentions a room they once lived in, specific, physical, grounded in objects. The stone soap kettles her mother used. The smell of birch ash lie in the rendering shed. The day she made her first batch of hard soap at 14, and her mother said nothing, which meant it was good. She had come to America at 22 with a husband who died of typhus on the ship. She had delivered her first baby in a sod house in Minnesota 3 months after landing, using knowledge she had learned from her mother and a knife she had sharpened on a river stone. She had never remarried. She had never stopped moving between settlements because the settlements never stopped needing someone who could deliver children, set bones, and keep fire burning in houses where the men had built everything except competence. I've closed the eyes of women who died because the room was too cold for a newborn to survive, Beret said one evening. Not because there was no fuel, because the fuel was outside and the snow was between them and it. Every one of those deaths was a distance problem, not a fuel problem. Marin understood then what Beret had understood from the beginning. The cups were not a replacement for wood. They were an answer to the space between the stove and the woodpile, the 30 yards that could become 30 miles in a blizzard. The innovation was not the fuel, it was the placement, warmth stored within reach. The disagreement came in February. Marin wanted to teach the men in the settlement how to modify their stove grates. She had noticed that a flat grate smothered the cups on the bottom surface, reducing airflow. If a narrow iron strip could be placed beneath the cups, a raised platform with gaps, the air would draw upward through the thumb hole more efficiently. She wanted to ask the blacksmith to bend strips for every stove in the settlement. Beret said no. "You're moving too fast," Beret said. Her voice was sharper than usual, thinned by ribs that had not healed cleanly. "You are teaching people to change their stoves before they have learned to pack a cup properly. If a man puts a grate wrong and his stove overdraws, the cup flares. If a cup flares in a tar paper cabin, the cabin burns." "The grate makes the cup work better," Marin said. "The cup works well enough without the grate. A cup that burns 8 minutes is a cup that keeps a family alive. A cup that burns 12 minutes because of a grate is not worth the risk of a cup that catches a wall because the grate was set wrong. You are afraid of a thing that has not happened." "I am afraid of a thing I have seen happen," Beret said. "In Minnesota, a man modified a stove he did not understand and burned his wife and daughter out of a house in the middle of February. The house was ash by morning. The woman lived. The daughter did not." The cabin went silent. Marin looked at Beret's face and saw something behind the argument that was older than the argument itself. A memory that had shaped every careful instruction, every rule about chimney cleaning, every insistence on discipline over speed. "I will teach the cups first," Marin said. "The grates can wait until spring." Beret nodded once. She picked up the rendering spoon and went back to work. The disagreement was over, but its weight remained in the room like the smell of smoke after a fire has been banked. Beret's lungs worsened through February. The blizzard exposure had done something to her breathing that rest could not undo. She coughed in the mornings, a deep, wet sound that came from low in her chest and left her gripping the edge of the table. She moved more slowly. She slept longer. She ate less. In late February, she asked Marin to ride with her to a berth. The Henriksen woman, the same one Beret had been traveling to see when the blizzard struck, was due again, early, and her husband was once more in Watertown. "I cannot lift my bag alone," Beret said. It was the first time she had admitted physical limitation aloud, and the words cost her something visible. They traveled by sled on a cold morning with a sky the color of tin. The road was a frozen rut that jolted the sled with every ridge, and Beret held her ribs with one hand and the sled rail with the other. She did not complain. She breathed through her teeth and looked ahead. The berth was at a one-room schoolhouse where the Henriksen woman had taken shelter when labor began during a supply trip. The building was freezing. The stove was cold. The wood box held 3 sticks of green cottonwood that would take an hour to catch. Frost clouded the single window. The Henriksen woman sat on a bench near the stove with her arms wrapped around her belly and her breath coming in short white plumes. Marin opened her pack and took out 3 travel tins, the small wrapped blocks she and Beret had designed together during the weeks of collaborative work. She set them in the stove, arranged with thumb holes up, and lit them with a single match. The flame caught the first block at the surface, crept inward through the thumb hole, and spread to the others through the coal bed. Within 15 minutes, the stove body was warm to the touch. Marin heated bricks on the stove top and wrapped them in cloth from Beret's bag. The baby came 2 hours later. Beret delivered it with hands that shook but did not falter. Hands that had delivered dozens of children in rooms worse than this one. Hands that remembered the work even when the body behind them was failing. Marin held the warmed bricks against the newborn's back while Beret cut the cord. The schoolhouse smelled like tallow and blood, and the clean, sharp scent of a new life that had no idea what kind of world it had entered. The Henriksen woman looked at the warm stove and the sealed tins and the wrapped bricks, and asked Marin what she had used to start the fire. Marin showed her a travel tin. The woman turned it over in her hands, pressed the thumb hole with her finger, and said, "Can you teach me to make these?" "After you rest," Marin said, "and after the baby eats." Beret watched from the bench where she had sat down after the delivery, her face gray with exhaustion, her ribs aching visibly with every breath. She watched Marin handle the stove and the bricks and the travel tins without a single instruction. Every lesson, the rendering, the dryness test, the thumb hole, the damper control, applied without prompting. Marin did not look at Beret for confirmation. She did not hesitate. She worked the way Beret worked, which was the way Beret's mother had worked, which was the way knowledge moves when it passes through hands instead of books. Beret said nothing, but her eyes stayed on Marin for a long time, and in them was something that looked like the particular satisfaction of a woman who has found the person who will carry what she carried. They returned to the claim the next day. Beret coughed the entire ride. Beret Asen died on the 14th of March. She did not die dramatically. She died the way many women on the frontier died, of a body that had been asked to do too much for too long in too much cold. Her lungs filled slowly over 10 days. The cough that had started as a morning nuisance deepened into something that woke Marin every night, a sound like cloth tearing in a closed room. Marin moved her to the bed and kept the stove burning around the clock, feeding night cakes every 40 minutes through the dark hours. She made broth from the last of the salt pork and held the cup to Beret's lips with her calloused hand, the one with the scar from the door latch. Beret ate less each day. She spoke less, but her hands kept moving, sorting sawdust on the blanket, pressing imaginary thumbholes into the air, the motions of a woman whose body was failing but whose work had not stopped. On the last day, Beret asked Marin to bring the rendering kettle from the shelf. Marin brought it. Beret held it in both hands, feeling the weight, the shape, the residue of 1,000 batches of clean fat. "This is yours now," Beret said, "and the thermometer. I do not want them. That is why you should have them." Beret died that night while the stove burned steady and the wind pressed against the north wall, and the thermometer read 56 degrees. Marin sat beside the bed until dawn. She did not cry. She did not speak. She held the rendering kettle in her lap and breathed the smell of tallow and pennyroyal that had soaked into the iron so deeply that no amount of scrubbing would ever remove it. The kettle still smelled like Beret's hands. It would smell like Beret's hands for years. Marin could not wash either scent away, and after a time she stopped trying. She buried Beret on the south side of the cabin, where the snow had thinned enough to dig. The ground was still half frozen, and the shovel rang against it like iron on stone. Marin dug for 2 hours and reached a depth that would hold. She wrapped Beret in the cleanest blanket she owned and lowered her carefully, the way Beret had lowered countless newborns into waiting arms, with steadiness, with care, with the particular attention that comes from knowing the weight of what you hold. She marked the grave with a flat stone and a sprig of dried sage from Beret's herb sack. She stood there for a moment in the late winter wind, feeling the absence of the woman who had arrived without invitation and changed everything without asking for credit. Then she went back inside and packed 14 cups before the sun went down. There was no other way to grieve. There was only the work, and the work continued. The secondary crisis came not from cold, but from water. Spring thaw arrived in late March with a violence that matched the winter. Snow that had packed 6 and 8 feet deep across the prairie melted in a rush. Creeks that had been frozen since November swelled past their banks. Low ground flooded. 3 families east of the Briquette place found their cabins standing in 6 inches of brown water, their wood piles soaked, their kindling boxes swamped, and their stoves useless. The temperature had not warmed enough to survive without heat. Night still dropped below freezing. A wet cabin with a dead stove was as dangerous in late March as a buried cabin had been in January. The cold was less extreme, but the misery was total. Wet clothes, wet bedding, wet children. Marin's cured fuel cakes, stored in sealed crocks and tins on the upper shelf, were dry. The water had not reached them. The tallow coating repelled moisture. The ash dusting kept the surface from absorbing damp air. While every family around her struggled to light soaked wood that hissed and steamed and refused to catch, Marin's cups burned the same way they had burned in January, steady, controlled, 8 to 10 minutes of clean heat through the thumbhole. The irony was bitter and precise. The families who had laughed at Marin for saving sawdust and grease, for hoarding what they called stove dirt, were now standing in flooded cabins holding matches over wood that would not light. The fuel they had trusted was stacked outside in neat cords, soaked through, useless. The fuel they had mocked was sealed in crocks on a shelf, dry as the day it was packed. Marin did not point this out. She loaded a sled with 40 cups packed in a sealed crock and pulled it to the Hendrickson place, where 2 children were shivering in wet blankets. The cabin floor was covered in muddy water. The stove was cold and the iron was damp to the touch. The children's mother stood by the door holding a split log that dripped water onto her boots. Marin knelt at the stove and opened the firebox. She placed 3 cups on the grate, arranged with thumbholes facing up, and struck a match. The flame caught the surface of the first cup, spread to the others through contact, and within 5 minutes the stove body was warming. She closed the damper to a narrow gap and let the cups do what they were built to do. She showed Mrs. Hendrickson how to build a drying rack above the stove, 2 boards suspended on pegs, the same design Beret had taught her in December. Wet wood placed on the rack would dry enough to burn within a day if the stove stayed warm. The cups would keep the stove warm while the wood dried. The wood would keep the stove going once the cups ran out. The cycle was self-sustaining as long as someone understood the sequence. She left 20 cups and instructions. 1 every 40 minutes, damp or narrow, clean the grate between cups. Do not pour loose sawdust into flame. Do not use uncured cups. Do not open the damper wide until the cup has caught fully. She did the same at the Olson claim and the Morrison place. 60 cups distributed in a single day, each one a small dry island of heat in a flooded landscape. Her own supply dropped to 112. She would make more. She always made more. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the storm is already at the door. The spring crisis proved something the winter blizzard had only suggested. The cups were not a blizzard invention. They were a preparedness practice. Anytime fuel was wet, inaccessible, or insufficient, whether from snow, flood, exhaustion, or poverty, a sealed crock of dry, packed fat and sawdust cakes could bridge the gap between a cold stove and a warm room. People began saving sawdust without being asked. The carpenter in Watertown set a barrel by his shop door for shavings. The butcher kept a bucket of fat scraps behind the counter and sold them for 2 cents a pound instead of throwing them to the dogs. Women packed cups at kitchen tables the way they packed preserves, methodically, seasonally, against the certainty that winter would return. Marin taught them all. She charged nothing. She corrected mistakes firmly, damp sawdust, dirty fat, cups packed too loose, and praised the ones that held shape and burned clean. She became the person people came to, not the person who came asking. But not everyone came to learn. Jonas Rusk came to copy. In early April, hand-lettered signs appeared at Havelock and Son General Store, advertising what Rusk called Rusk's Patent Prairie Fuel Cups. The cups were displayed in a wooden crate near the front counter, brown, lumpy, wrapped in paper. They looked like Marin's cups, the way a child's drawing looks like the thing it represents. The shape was there, but the knowledge was not. Rusk had made them with damp sweepings from the store floor and rancid grease skimmed from a cooking pit behind the boarding house. He had not clarified the fat. He had not tested the sawdust for moisture. He had not pressed thumb holes. He had packed them solid and heavy, counting on weight to suggest value. A man named Dahl bought 4 for 12 cents and tried one in his stove that evening. The cup smoked so badly that his wife opened the door to clear the air, and the draft blew ash across their supper table. The fat spat and popped because the impurities had not been removed. The cup did not burn. It smoldered, producing a thick, acrid haze that clung to clothes and hair and did not dissipate for hours. Dahl returned to the store the next morning and threw the remaining 3 cups on Rusk's counter. "These are poison, not fuel," he said. Word spread faster than Rusk could contain it. The cups were bad. Rusk's method was wrong. Within a week, 3 more customers had returned his cups, and the crate sat behind the counter gathering dust. Marin heard about it from Niels, who had been at the store when Dahl returned the cups. She did not go to the store. She did not confront Rusk. She waited. When 2 women from the settlement came to her cabin the following week to ask whether Rusk's cups were safe, Marin answered with a demonstration. She took one of Rusk's cups. Niels had brought her a sample and cut it open with a knife. The inside was wet. Dark streaks of unrendered meat fiber ran through the sawdust. The fat was yellow and rancid, soft to the touch even in the cold cabin. "He sold weight," Marin said. "Fuel needs dryness." She set one of her own cups beside Rusk's and cut it open. The inside was uniform, pale brown, firm. The fat was distributed evenly. The sawdust was dry to the center. The thumb hole ran clean through the middle. "This is the difference between making something and understanding something," she said. The women nodded. They told others. The settlement understood, in the way that small communities understand things, that Marin Tveit's method was earned and Jonas Rusk's was stolen, and that the theft had failed because you cannot steal discipline. Rusk did not apologize. He did not remove the sign from the store. But no one bought another cup, and by mid-April the crate had been moved to the back room where unsold inventory went to gather dust beside broken lamp parts and warped barrel staves. The $27 debt remained unpaid. Marin had not earned the money. The blizzard and the spring flood had consumed every resource she had: fat, sawdust, time, strength, and converted it into warmth for other people. She had nothing left to sell and nothing left to trade except the method itself, and the method she gave away for free. Rusk remained silent about the debt. He did not send his agent. He did not post a notice. The January 15th deadline had come and gone, and now April was half finished, and the man who had told her she was pretending had not spoken her name in public since his cups failed. The silence was louder than the mockery had been. Marin did not know what it meant, but she knew it was not surrender. Men like Rusk did not surrender. They waited for a different angle. By the autumn of 1881, Marin Tveit's cabin had changed. Not in size, it was still 16 by 18 feet, tar paper patched, with one cast iron box stove and a door latch. She had replaced herself with a proper iron hook. But the cabin now had a covered fuel passage attached to the north wall, a narrow enclosed corridor, 4 feet wide and 8 feet long, built from salvaged lumber and sealed with clay chinking. The passage connected the cabin to a fuel shed where sealed crocks and tins of cured cups stood on shelves in rows, so neat they looked like a pantry stocked for a siege. Inside the main cabin, Beret's rendering kettle sat on a shelf above the stove, blackened beyond cleaning. Beside it hung the salvaged oven thermometer. Below the shelf, The drying rack held a fresh batch of night cakes, dense, ash-dusted, thumb holes clean and open. The smell of the cabin was pine resin and clean tallow, the same smell it had carried since December of 1880, when a spilled pan of bacon grease had started everything. Marin's workbench occupied the west wall. On it, a hand plane, a draw knife, a wooden mallet with a worn handle, a stack of flour sacks filled with sorted sawdust, fine pine in one, coarse oak in another, mixed hardwood in a third. Jars of clarified tallow lined the shelf above the bench, each one strained 3 times and sealed with waxed cloth. A board nailed to the wall held her production notes, scratched in charcoal, ratios, burn times, curing schedules, dryness tests. The notes had grown over the months from a few marks on a shelf board to a full record of every variation she had tried, every failure she had corrected, every lesson Beret had taught her. On a typical morning, Marin rose before dawn, checked the stove, and began the day's rendering. Fat arrived now from sources she had not imagined a year ago. The butcher in Watertown saved scraps in a bucket and let her collect them once a week for 3 cents a pound. 2 farm wives brought bacon grease in jars after rendering their own lard, keeping the clean fat for cooking and giving Marin the heavy dark residue they could not use. The blacksmith's wife saved forge grease. Even Havelock at the general store set aside spoiled tallow candles that no longer burned clean. Marin melted them down and re-rendered the fat. Sawdust was easier. The carpenter in Watertown had placed a barrel by his shop door marked with a charcoal T. Anyone could dump shavings in it. Most did. By winter, Marin collected 2 flour sacks a week from the barrel alone. She packed cups in the afternoon, working at the bench with the steady rhythm of someone who has done a thing so many times that the hands move without the mind's instruction. 4 parts sawdust, 1 part tallow, pressed into tins with the wooden mallet, thumb hole centered, ash dusted on the surface, set on the drying rack for 24 hours. She could pack 30 cups in an afternoon. She had made over 2,000 since the blizzard. Most of them she gave away. The teaching had become its own rhythm. Women came first because women controlled the kitchen fat, the stove tending, and the household scraps. They came to Marin's cabin in 2s and 3s, carrying jars of grease and sacks of sawdust, and Marin showed them the same way Beret had shown her, through doing, not talking. She set the rendering kettle on the stove and demonstrated clean fat. She squeezed sawdust in her fist. She packed a cup, pressed the thumb hole, dusted it with ash, and set it on the coals. The women watched the flame draw inward through the channel and hold steady for 8 minutes. Then they did it themselves. Marin corrected without softness. Your sawdust is damp. Feel how it clumps. Spread it on the rack for another day. Too much fat. The cup will smoke and waste half its heat up the pipe. Press harder. A loose cup flashes instead of burning. The women accepted the corrections the way they accepted instructions for anything that kept children alive, without argument and with close attention. Sigrid Haugen became the first woman besides Marin to teach someone else. She showed her sister-in-law at the Hogen claim, and the sister-in-law showed 2 neighbors, and by November the method was spreading through the settlement the way quilting patterns spread, hand to hand, table to table, corrected each time by someone who had learned from the person before them. Men came later, and with more resistance. They came because their wives told them to, or because August Lindholm, whose opinion still carried weight among the farmers and freighters, demonstrated burn control at the blacksmith shop one afternoon using 3 night cakes and a borrowed stove. The men watched the thermometer climb and the smoke stay thin and the cakes hold their shape through the full burn. They stopped calling it kitchen nonsense after that. August helped modify stove grates. The disagreement Beret had feared, men altering stoves they did not understand, was resolved by August's authority. He and the blacksmith bent removable iron strips that sat inside the firebox, lifting the cups off the flat grate so air could draw upward through the thumb hole from below. The strips were simple: two pieces of flat iron bent into low bridges, set 3 inches apart, removable for cleaning. They added 2 minutes of burn time per cup and reduced ash buildup on the grate surface. Marin inspected every modified stove before she approved its use. She tested the draw, checked the clearance, and burned a cup while watching the smoke. 2 stoves failed the test, one because the strips were set too high, creating too much draft and causing the cup to flare, and one because the owner had packed the strips with rags to keep them from rattling, blocking the airflow entirely. Marin removed the rags, adjusted the strips, and burned a test cup until the owner understood the difference. "You cannot improve what you do not understand," she told him. It was the kind of sentence Beret would have said, and Marin heard the echo in her own voice and did not mind it. Jonas Rusk's final reckoning came during an April cold snap in 1881. Spring had arrived early that year, thawing the ground and softening the roads, and convincing most of the settlement that winter was finished. Then a freeze returned overnight. Not a blizzard, not a killing storm, but a hard, sustained cold that dropped the temperature below zero for 3 days and reminded everyone that the prairie did not follow calendars. Rusk was at the store when the cold hit. He had been living behind the counter for most of the winter, sleeping in a back room on a cot, eating from the store's stock, and keeping warm with a pot-bellied stove that he fed with wood stacked outside the back door. The wood was wet. Spring melt had soaked the pile, and Rusk, who had never learned to store fuel inside reach, who had mocked the woman who did, found himself in a store with a smoking stove, damp kindling, and 2 children. The children belonged to a farmer named Dahl, the same man who had returned Rusk's failed fuel cups months earlier. Dahl had left his son and daughter at the store while he rode to Watertown for seed, expecting to return by evening. The cold snap caught him on the road and forced him to shelter at a way station. The children were stranded with Rusk and a stove that could not hold heat. Marin heard about it from Niels Breke, who had been at the store buying rope when the temperature dropped. Niels rode to her cabin and told her the situation plainly. 2 children, a cold store, a man too proud to ask for help. Marin packed a crock of travel tins and rode with Niels. The ride took 40 minutes in the cold, and by the time they reached the store, the sun had gone behind a bank of gray cloud that turned the light flat and hard. Smoke leaked from the store's chimney in thin, dirty wisps, the kind of smoke that comes from a fire fighting for its life. They tied the horses and entered through the front door. The air inside hit Marin's face, cold, smoky, with the sour smell of damp wood steaming against hot iron. The pot-bellied stove in the center of the store was barely warm. Rusk stood behind it, feeding split logs into the firebox one at a time, each log hissing as moisture turned to steam. The fire was not burning. It was arguing with the fuel and losing. The children sat on flour sacks near the stove, wrapped in bolts of unsold calico fabric. Their faces were pale. The girl, perhaps 7, had her hands tucked into her armpits and her shoulders hunched so high they nearly touched her ears. The boy, older, maybe 10, watched Rusk with the particular attention of a child who knows something is wrong but cannot name it. Neither child spoke. The store was large enough that the cold lived in the corners, pooling against the walls, gathering under the counters, pressing in through the plank floor from the frozen ground beneath. The stove could not fight it because the stove was burning water instead of wood. Marin set the crock on the counter without speaking. She opened the stove door and examined the firebox. The wood inside was hissing, steam rising from the split surfaces, the fire struggling to hold against the moisture. Ash had built up on the grate because the wet wood produced more residue than dry fuel. The draw was poor because the pipe was cold, The smoke sat in the chimney instead of rising, thickening the air in the store with every minute. She raked the firebox clean with the store's iron poker, scraping the ash into the pan below. She removed Rusk's damp wood piece by piece and stacked it on the floor beside the stove to dry. She opened the crock and took out 6 travel tins, the small wrapped blocks she and Beret had designed, the same ones she had used to warm the schoolhouse for the Henriksen baby, the same design she had crawled through a blizzard to deliver to the Brecka family. She set 3 tins on the clean grate, thumb holes up, and lit them with a single match. The flame caught the first block at the surface, spread inward through the thumb hole, and jumped to the others through the coal bed forming between them. Within 2 minutes, all 3 were burning with the steady, clean heat of a fuel that had been cured properly, packed properly, and stored dry. The stovepipe warmed. The draw returned. Smoke cleared from the room. The girl lowered her shoulders half an inch. Rusk stood behind the counter and watched. He did not speak. He did not move to help. He watched Marin work his stove with the quiet, controlled motions of someone who had done this 1,000 times, and he watched the temperature in the store begin to climb. Marin added the remaining 3 tins once the stove body was warm. She dried 2 of Rusk's split logs on top of the stove, turning them every 10 minutes until the hissing stopped. She set the dried logs in the firebox beside the burning tins. The wood caught within minutes, fed by the coal bed the tins had built. The store warmed. The girl uncurled her hands from her armpits. The boy stopped watching Rusk and started watching the stove. Marin picked up one of Rusk's remaining damp logs and split it with the store's hatchet on the back step. She brought the split pieces inside and set them on the stovetop to dry. She did this 4 times until there was enough dry wood inside the store to last the night. Then she picked up the crock and turned to leave. Rusk spoke. "I misjudged the waste," he said. His voice was flat, not apologetic, not warm. The voice of a man who has been forced to revise an estimate he would rather not have been wrong about. Marin stopped at the door. She did not turn around. "No," she said. "You misjudged the work." She left. Niels was waiting outside with the horses. They rode back to her claim in silence. The cold was sharp, but the sky was clear and the stars were close and hard, and the stove in Marin's cabin was burning steady when she opened the door. The $27 debt was never collected. Rusk did not forgive it. Forgiveness was not a word that lived in his vocabulary. He simply stopped mentioning it. The ledger page remained in his book with the amount written in his precise hand, but no agent came, no notice was filed, and no proceedings began. Whether this was gratitude or embarrassment or simple calculation that pursuing the debt would cost him more in reputation than the money was worth, Marin never knew and never asked. The crate of Rusk's patent prairie fuel cups remained in the back room of the store for the rest of the year. In November, Havelock used them to wedge a door open. No one commented. Torsten Moen arrived in May of 1881. He was 34, a blacksmith and wagon repairman, August Lindholm's nephew by marriage. He had spent the winter in Sioux Falls working a forge and heard about the blizzard and the fuel cups from a letter August sent in February, a letter that described Marin's method with the technical precision of a man who understood materials and respected what he could not explain away. Torsten came to see the cups. He stayed because of the stove. He was a large man with careful hands, the kind of careful that comes from years of working with hot iron, where a moment of carelessness costs skin. He arrived at Marin's cabin on a borrowed horse, introduced himself as August's nephew, and asked if he could examine the fuel cups and the modified stove grate. Marin let him in. He spent an hour at the workbench, turning cups over, pressing the thumb holes, breaking one apart to examine the ratio of sawdust to fat. He studied the drying rack, the rendering kettle, the ash collection. Then he knelt at the stove and examined the iron strips August and the blacksmith had made. "The strips are good," he said, "but the edges are rough. They catch ash. If you rounded the top edge and beveled the base, the ash would slide off instead of building up." "Can you make that?" Marin asked. "I can make that. I can also make a packing ring, an iron cylinder with a plunger that presses the mixture into uniform cups. Your hand packing is good, but a ring would make every cup the same density, and the same density means the same burn time." Marin looked at him. In 6 months of making cups, no one had offered to improve the tools. People had come to learn the method. Torsten was the first to look at the method and see the machinery it needed. "Make the ring," she said, "and bring it back so I can test it." He brought it back 3 days later, a short iron cylinder, open at both ends, with a wooden plunger that fit snugly inside. Marin filled the cylinder with her 4-to-1 mixture, inserted the plunger, and pressed. The cup that emerged was uniform, dense, perfectly cylindrical, with a hole in the center where Marin had placed a wooden dowel before packing. She removed the dowel, and the thumb hole was clean, centered, and consistent. She burned the test cup. 9 minutes. Steady flame, thin smoke, clean ash. "The ring works," she said. Torsten nodded. Then he said, "May I build a second workbench? Mine would go against the east wall. I would not move yours." That was the courtship. Not flowers, not declarations. A man asking permission to build a workbench beside a woman's workbench in her cabin using her wall. Marin said yes. The partnership grew through shared work the way most frontier partnerships did, by proving useful before proving anything else. Torsten built the packing rings and vented cups. He designed a covered fuel shed with a short enclosed passage connecting it to the cabin, the same passage that Marin used every morning. He repaired her stovepipe with a proper collar joint that never leaked again. He helped her rebuild the woodshed closer to the cabin and hang the door so it opened inward, the way every door should open in snow country. Marin taught him the method. He learned the ratios, the dryness test, the rendering process. He packed cups alongside her in the evenings, his large hands working the iron ring with the same precision he used at the forge. They tested variations together, different sawdust sizes, different fat mixtures, different curing times. On one evening in July, Torsten suggested mixing fine sawdust with coarse shavings to create a cup that caught faster at the surface but burned slower at the core. They tested it. The mixed cup burned 11 minutes, the longest burn time Marin had recorded. Bray would have wanted to know why, Marin said, looking at the thermometer. "Why does it burn longer?" "The coarse shavings create air pockets inside the packed mixture. The fine dust fills the gaps and holds the fat. The fire finds the air pockets and burns through them first, then works on the dense sections. 2 speeds in 1 cup. Torsten looked at her. "You sound like an engineer." "I sound like a woman who has burned 2,000 cups and paid attention." They argued about draft settings the way other couples argued about fence lines. He preferred a wider, damper opening because his forge training taught him that fire needs air. She preferred the narrow opening Beret had taught her because the cups burned longer with less draft. They compromised. Wide at lighting, narrow after the catch, wide again in the last 2 minutes to consume the remaining fuel completely. The arguments were productive. The draft settings improved. They married in the autumn of 1881. The ceremony was brief, a traveling preacher, a cold morning, and a few words spoken outside the church while the first leaves turned brown. August stood as witness. Niels brought bread. Peter stood behind his father and watched with the solemn attention of a boy who understood better than most adults what this woman had done and what she deserved. No one from the settlement mentioned that Maren had been a deserted wife, or that Torsten had arrived with nothing but a borrowed horse and a set of blacksmith tools. What mattered was what they built together, and what they built was visible to anyone who walked past the claim. Torsten proved up on an adjacent quarter section the following spring. He built a forge shed on the boundary line between their claims so that it served both properties. The shed had a proper chimney, a bellows, and an anvil he traded 3 months' labor to acquire. From that forge came the tools the method needed to spread. Maren did not bear children of her own, but the claim was never empty of young people. Niels's sons came to learn forge work from Torsten. Sigrid Haugen's daughter spent 2 autumns at the workbench learning to pack cups for her own household. A boy from the Morrison claim apprenticed at the forge for a year and left knowing how to bend iron packing rings and how to cure fuel cakes that burned clean. The cabin became a place where knowledge was traded as naturally as goods. Someone came with a question and left with a skill. The years compressed the way frontier years do, not by growing shorter, but by filling with work that made the months indistinguishable. By the winter of 1882, 6 households stored emergency fuel cakes in sealed crocks near the stove instead of relying entirely on outdoor wood. The method had become habit. Women packed cups during autumn the way they put up preserves, methodically, seasonally, against the certainty that winter would return. Maren inspected every household's first batch and corrected the ones that failed the squeeze test or the burn test. She visited each home once before the first hard freeze and checked the seal on the crocks, the position of the stove grate, and the condition of the chimney. By 1883, the carpenter's barrel in Watertown was joined by a second barrel at the feed store and a third at the blacksmith shop. Sawdust collection became communal. The butcher began selling clean fat scraps by the bucket instead of throwing them to dogs. A small economy formed around waste. Materials that had been worthless in November of 1880 now had value because someone had proved they could burn. By 1884, the church cellar near Lake Campesca held a community reserve. 200 cured fuel cups stored in sealed crocks, packed with sawdust contributed by carpenters, fat rendered from butchering days, ash collected from every stove in the settlement. The reserve was maintained by a rotation of women who inspected the cups each month, discarding any that had softened or absorbed moisture, and replacing them with fresh stock. The system was not Maren's invention alone. It was the method, distributed, maintained by the people who had learned it. Women taught the method at quilting gatherings, where the talk moved between stitch patterns and burn ratios without anyone remarking on the shift. Girls learned to pack cups the way they learned to mend cloth, from their mothers, by watching, by doing, by being corrected until the hands remembered what the mind had not yet named. August Lindholm, who had once told Maren she had a claim shanty pretending to be a house, now told every new settler the same thing. Keep dry fuel inside reach before you count the wood stacked outdoors. He said it with the authority of a man who had burned hay in his own barn because his coal ran out, and no one argued with him. Niels Brecke taught his sons to save planer shavings. Peder, the boy who had crawled through a blizzard with news of Beret's overturned sled, grew into a young man who kept a sealed crock beside every stove he would ever own. He never forgot the cold of that crawl, and he never forgot the warmth that met him on the other side of Maren's door. Maren did not become famous. Her name did not appear in newspapers or territorial records. The method she developed spread not as a patent or a published technique, but as a habit, passed from hand to hand, corrected by each person who taught the next, adapted to local materials and local stoves. In some settlements it was called prairie fuel. In others it had no name at all, only the practice. Save the sawdust, render the fat, pack it tight, press the hole, dust it with ash, and keep it where you can reach it when the door's buried. Torsten built tools for the method as it grew, packing rings in 3 sizes, vented cup molds with built-in thumbhole dowels, a hand-cranked press for families that produced in quantity. Each tool was forged at the workbench beside Marin's, tested at the stove they shared, and given to the families that asked for them. He did not sell the tools. Marin did not sell the cups. The method was free because the method had been free when Beret taught it to Marin, and before that when Christy Tveit had taught her daughter that fat remembers fire. In the evenings, after the cups were packed and the stove was banked for the night, Marin sometimes took the rendering kettle from the shelf above the stove and held it. The iron was warm from the stove's heat. The smell of tallow and pennyroyal rose from the metal the way a voice rises from a room where someone once spoke. She never washed the scent away. Years later, on a morning in the mid-1890s, when the first snow of the season had just begun to cover the path between the cabin and the fuel shed, Marin showed a young widow named Eli Solheim how to press a thumbhole through a packed fuel cake. Eli had arrived at the claim with 2 children, a trunk of clothes, and a dead husband's unpaid lumber bill. She had walked 3 miles from the settlement because someone at the store had told her that the woman on the Tveit claim knew how to keep a cabin warm on nothing. She reminded Marin of someone, though Marin did not say so. The same set of the jaw. The same look in the eyes that was not desperation but calculation. The look of a woman counting what she had and measuring it against what she needed. Marin sat her at the workbench and showed her the materials. The flour sack of dry sawdust, the jar of clarified tallow, the iron packing ring Torsten had forged, the ash bucket, the drying rack above the stove. She demonstrated each step the way Beret had demonstrated to her 15 years ago through hands, not words. She filled the ring. She pressed the mixture. She inserted the dowel, packed around it, and withdrew it to leave the thumbhole. She dusted the surface with ash. She set the finished cup on the rack. The young woman watched Marin press her thumb through the center of the cake, one smooth motion, firm and straight, pulling out clean to leave the channel open. The motion was automatic. Marin had done it thousands of times. Her hands knew the pressure, the angle, the depth, the way a hand knows the shape of a door handle in the dark. "How did you know?" Eli asked. "To save the sawdust and the fat, before you understood what it was for." Marin set the cake on the drying rack and wiped her hands on her apron. The apron was stained with tallow and ash, the way it had been stained for 15 years. She thought about the spilled pan of bacon grease on the 9th day. She thought about her mother's voice saying that fat remembers fire. She thought about Beret picking up a cup and asking what ratio, the first serious question anyone had asked. "Some lessons wait in the hands until the mind catches up," she said. Eli nodded. She picked up the mallet, filled the iron ring with the 4-to-1 mixture, and pressed her own thumb through the center. The hole was slightly off-center. Marin adjusted her grip, 2 fingers here, thumb angled straight, pressed through in one motion. The next one was straight. "Good," Marin said. Nothing more. It was the way Beret's mother had said nothing when the first batch of soap came out right. Silence meant good. Eli understood. Outside, the snow thickened. The path to the fuel shed was disappearing under white. Inside, the stove ticked, and the rendering kettle sat on its shelf, and the rack held a row of new cups drying beside the ones Marin had packed that morning. Eli packed 3 more, each one better than the last, and Marin watched without correcting because there was nothing left to correct. The work continued. It always continued. That was the point. By the winter after the blizzard, 6 families near Lake Campesca kept sealed crocks of fuel cakes within arm's reach of the stove. The church cellar held a shared reserve that no one had touched yet, and everyone was glad to know existed. August Lindholm, who had once tapped a stovepipe, and pronounced a woman's claim, a coffin in waiting, told new settlers to keep dry fuel inside before counting wood stacked outside. Niels Brecke's sons saved plainer shavings without being asked. The method spread not as a patent, but as a habit, the way all useful things spread on the frontier, quietly, from hand to hand, corrected each time by someone who had learned the hard way what happened when a step was skipped. Maren Tveit remained on her claim near Lake Kampeska. She expanded the cabin into a tighter, warmer house with an enclosed fuel passage and a forge shed where Torsten built packing rings and stove tools. She kept Bere Assen's rendering kettle on a shelf above the stove, blackened beyond any cleaning, smelling of tallow and pennyroyal in a way that no amount of soap would change. She died in old age, in a warm room, in a house she had held through a winter that tried to take it. Her life was measured less by public record than by the number of winter rooms that stayed warm because she taught people what to save and where to keep it. The door had been buried under 10 feet of snow. The woodshed had stood 30 yards away, close enough to see on a clear day, far enough to kill on a blind one. The stove had waited for its next breath, and a woman the settlement had dismissed as unstable had fed it with garbage and grease and kept it burning for 10 days while the prairie buried everything it could reach. Niels Brecke had said it plainly, back when the cups were a curiosity and the blizzard was a theory. A woman who saves ashes and kitchen fat has started feeding fear instead of stock. The stove answered him. The flame drew inward through the thumbhole. The frost loosened from the window nail by nail. And years later, a girl opened a crock beside her mother's stove and found neat brown fuel cakes stacked inside like bread. Outside, the first snow had begun to cover the path to the woodpile. Inside, the girl already knew what to reach for. The prairie had taught Maren Tveit what it taught everyone eventually. The thing that saves you is often the thing others told you to throw away.